protection on the blockchain. So I'd like to welcome our panelists to the stage. And just a reminder, if people have questions that they'd like to ask the panelists, please do download the Slido app or go to Slido in your browser. That's sli.do. And you can ask questions through there if you log in with the code consensus2015.
All right, so today we are talking about consumer protection and the blockchain. I'm joined by James Newsome of Delta Strategy Group. He's a partner advisor for Bitfury Group. Martine Niejadlik, she's the former chief compliance officer for Coinbase. Joe Colangelo, the executive director of Consumers Research. And David Tait, also of the Commonwealth Secretariat, with the cybercrime policy analyst with the Rule of Law Division. So we're just going to jump right into it. We only have 20 minutes, unfortunately. Lots of ground to cover, I'm sure. So the first question I want to pose to you guys, we can just move on down the line, is what are the risks facing consumers today when they interact with digital currencies? Take it away.
I think first you have to understand the direction I come from. I'm in D.C., so I look at things from a D.C. perspective. Chaired one of the one of the federal agencies that I think is going to have some oversight over the Bitcoin space, particularly as it relates to derivatives. But I think, when you look at consumers, I think a couple things come to mind. A lack of knowledge or education about how to use Bitcoin or how to use the blockchain. When I first started having meetings 2 years ago in D.C. with members of Congress or regulators, they knew very little about Bitcoin. They knew nothing about the blockchain. And the little they knew about Bitcoin was negative because of what they read in the press. So it's been a big hurdle to overcome in front of regulators and members of Congress. But I think we've made a lot of progress through Jerry and Perry Ann and the groups that spend a lot of time in D.C. So I think everything that we can do among the areas of education is important. And then the other, I think, that gives comfort to a number of people is having some kind of regulatory oversight, some kind of stamp of approval from government regulators that, this is safe. I've got comfort to participate in what we're trying to do.
Cool. Martine?
Yeah, I would say that it depends on what the consumers are actually doing with the technology. So if a consumer is downloading their own software on their own computer and is managing their own Bitcoin and their own private keys, then you have risks such as the consumer's losing their keys, the consumer gets spammed and is convinced to, save their cousin who's in jail in Mexico by sending Bitcoin to somebody. If they're spending Bitcoin, you have the typical merchant types of risks, right, where they bought something from a merchant, and I'm sure if it's overstock.com, that's fine. But if it's not, they may not actually receive the good or service. That's another issue. If they're using hosted services, though, then you run into a new set of issues, which includes, does the company have proper security? Is the company keeping the private keys safely? Or is something, happening there? People doing denial of service attacks, those types of things. Company could be going defunct. And what happens to the person's assets. And then obviously there's just the standard financial risk of owning Bitcoin and having it go down in value. I think we're going to get into consumer protections, obviously. Some of those issues that I just mentioned warrant some level of consumer protections. Some of them are probably more in the consumer beware type category. But we'll get to that next. But I think it does sort of depend on what's happening with the service. And when we think about consumer protections, it's really important to look at each use case differently.
Joe?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think most of it's been covered, but if you were to look at the spectrum of people who use Bitcoin right now, probably the number one threat to them is hosted services running away with their money. There are a lot of other threats out there, but historically, there are over 70 documented cases of Bitcoin thefts over 500 Bitcoin. The vast majority of those are hosted services running away with those Bitcoin. So that's caveat emptor is not something we use in consumer protection law in the United States, but when you're trusting somebody in Russia or who knows where with your Bitcoin, that's the only thing that you have right now.
David?
I'm a lawyer, so I'm going to say I think the major problem is regulatory and legislative frameworks. In a European context, there's the reality is that the Consumer Rights Directive applies solely to goods and services, and then this third and slightly problematic pillar of digital content And so there does seem to be an unequal level of protection given to consumers who use fiat currencies as opposed to in purchases online, as opposed to those who are using virtual currencies. So I think that inequality and that disparity can be quite off-putting, and perhaps is a reason why consumers haven't taken up and leapt onto virtual currencies and transactions in the way that we might have hoped that they would.
Cool. All right. Well, so moving on from there, what kinds of solutions do you see? Whether it's a educational initiative, a regulatory framework, agency policies. What kinds of solutions, based on your perspective, your opinion, do you think can help address some of these concerns, James?
Well, I'll go back to the two areas that I mentioned: regulation and education. As I was on the train coming from DC this afternoon, I received a notice that LedgerX, which is applied for registration to the CFTC to become a futures exchange and clearinghouse, has received their temporary approval for registration. So I think that's a huge first step. But so I think that'll be the first time that a Bitcoin-related company, to my knowledge, is operating under the regulation of a U.S. agency. So I think it's important because, and I think CFTC, which happens to be the agency I used to chair, I think that's an important first step because the CFTC will not attempt to regulate the underlying Bitcoin, simply derivatives traded on the Bitcoin. So it's kind of a government stamp of approval without any kind of heavy-handed oversight of the underlying Bitcoin. So I think that's a great first step, and we just have to continue on in that path. The educational standpoint, I've seen a couple of friends that I was at the Necker Island conference several months back, and one of the things we talked about there was really educating enforcement agencies, because their first response is to throw up their hands and step back and assume that everybody's involved in this process is defrauding customers or doing something bad. So we've been working with a number of the enforcement agencies, the FBI, Secret Service, et cetera, on this educational program that Bitfury has been very involved in, and a number of other companies that are here will be participating in as well. We're not ready to formally announce it yet. Jason Weinstein, an attorney that used to work at the Department of Justice, has been coordinating that. But I think within a couple of weeks, we'll be able to announce the companies that are supportive and will be providing the education, and the agencies that are going to be on the receiving end of that education as well. So we're, in the DC way, we're trying to take some steps to address both of the issues that I raised.
Martine?
I mean, I'll certainly agree that I think education and regulation are important. Just so for folks that may not know, March 18th of 2013, FinCEN came out with guidance that existing regulation applies to exchanges and administrators of virtual currency. So this is anyone putting virtual currency into circulation, or anybody exchanging currency from either one virtual currency to another, or any fiat to a virtual currency. So there's actually many companies that have been regulated even since before that guidance came out. That was guidance saying the regulation, in case you missed it, applies. And I can tell you that behind the scenes, lots of these companies, and the one I worked for, spent large amounts of time working on all of the behind the scenes requirements that you need to have as a money service business, which is how they classify these companies. I do think one thing that is still requires more clarity with respect to regulation is wallet-based services. My company happened to be both, so it was sort of a moot point. But if I'm only a service that maintains private keys on behalf of a customer, what are my requirements? What do I have to do? What happens if I lose the keys? Am I required to do some kind of cold storage, mechanism, or what do I do, and who's overseeing that? I mean, even any company today who's taking credit card information would typically have to be PCI compliant. There really isn't an equivalent of that yet in this industry. And I think that would go a long way with consumers entrusting these third-party services to purchase and sell Bitcoin with, and to hold their Bitcoin. And by the way, I personally think, I've been in the internet space for a long time and have dealt with a lot of trust and safety and fraud type issues. I think it would be pretty hard for a consumer to do all this stuff on their own. And if they can find a trusted service to use, it would be much better for them to have a nice web application interface where they go and they do what they need to do, but they're not worrying about what a private key is. An average Joe should not have to know what that means and should not have to manage it and should not have to put it in their safe deposit box. But I do think wallet services need a little bit more thought, and this is probably, we're approaching the time where that's required, so most people probably know about Mt. Gox. So regulation, it's, some stuff I think has been done, which has been really good. And a lot of education. Most of my family, has never really understood what I did ever in my life. Certainly doesn't understand this, but yeah, I think we're still in early stages of that. And by the way, obviously I joined the industry a little bit crazy to probably be one of the first chief compliance officers in this space, but I also obviously see a lot of potential for the technology.
But I think one of the difficulties, just adding on to what you said, is that when you look at agencies in DC, our industry doesn't fit well within any particular box because you've got currency type issues, AML type issues, technology issues. So I think when agencies look at this space, they think, well, what I do maybe relates here, but it doesn't relate to anything else. So the fact that it doesn't fit neatly into one regulatory box is an issue in DC. And even though the Treasury and the SEC, they've said, well, it's not a currency, it's not a security, they still have AML rules that they regulate. So even if you're not a registrant within that agency, they may still have some oversight over part of what you do.
Joe?
So education regulation seems to be the theme. I would say education is certainly helpful. The more people know about something, there's no greater force for moving something through the legislative process than cultural acceptance and excitement. But we don't expect consumers in America to be educated about the harmful effects of arsenic. We just expect that arsenic is not put into food, right? So we don't operate in a regime where we can say consumers just need to learn what the private key is. They just need to learn how to, set up their own multi-signature wallets, and everything's going to be fine. We need that regulation side, and fortunately, there is already this great, this set of regulations, passing no opinion on the regulations that exist, but they already exist. And so applying those regulations to Bitcoin companies is going to be, should give them the legitimacy to operate legally. One thing that's kind of missing for one of these small wallet providers or startups that can't afford big compliance budgets is this compliance as a service. And I think we're already seeing this now. You have LibreTax doing the tax side of things. You have a lot of other companies that are just compliance focused. And Bitcoin has this really unique ability to have multiple parties own coins or manage the fiduciary responsibility of coins. So if one or a majority of those parties ends up being just a compliance signature or something like that, that might be something that the market provides to really protect consumers while we're waiting for the regulations and the educational acceptance.
So moving away from the American example slightly to look at, again, Europe, the application of the Consumer Rights Directive, as I said, is slightly unfair and uneven, I should say, and it gets particularly so when it's transcribed into national law. So in the countries that I work particularly in, that would be the UK, Cyprus, and Malta. And the result of it is that the remedies that are available to consumers under that legislative framework are fundamentally different because here we're talking about the example of wallet services. They're not classified as goods or services that are being provided. They're classified as digital content. And the remedies that are available are considerably restricted in relation to digital content as opposed to the supply of goods and services in a traditional sense. So in that area, there are some other legislative frameworks that have been quite effectively adapted. One of which is the Consumer Protection Act 2008 in South Africa, which doesn't, in terms of payment for goods and services, is very open and recognises the acceptance of any form of token, and similarly defines goods extremely broadly to include data, software, code, and other intangible product written or encoded on any medium or a license to use any such intangible product. So the consumer protection regime there applies absolutely to situations like wallets, and at the same time also applies absolutely to transactions utilizing virtual currencies to acquire services. So that regime is quite robust, and doesn't have this third and slightly unwieldy pillar of digital content. So I think really the solution is to have draft legislation which is much more all-encompassing.
Cool. All right, well, to kind of take it one step further, what are some ways that the technology itself can be leveraged to address some of these concerns? James?
Well, I would, going back to the education example, I'll use a real-life example. When the internet was first developed, and the law enforcement agencies looked at the internet and they saw pornography. And, if we're all honest, pornography is what made the internet famous to begin with. So part of the process was educating these law enforcement agencies that, forget about pornography. This is what the technology is, this is how it works, and this is how you can use it to help you do your job. So I think that's part of what we're trying to do with the education process we're about to announce, is not only educate them about what the blockchain technology is, but how they can actually use it to do a better job within the agency.
Martine?
I would say a lot of it is built into the technology itself. So one of the things that got me super excited, and again, I spent many years trying to combat fraud on the internet, is I had this light bulb moment one day where I realized that most of the way that we pay is we give a merchant a financial instrument, credit card, bank account, whatever it is, and we give them our identity, our name, our address, whatever. Some of that I may have to do anyway because I want them to ship me something. But now that merchant has all the information that they need to A, charge my card again or charge my account again, or if that merchant, maybe they're a great merchant, but they're have an unfortunate situation like a Target, and all my information is stolen, and then we've got a big identity theft problem, and it just goes into a big circle, and people start creating new accounts, and the whole bit. And one of the coolest things I think about Bitcoin is that I can push my money on a per transaction basis. I can push my Bitcoin to the recipient. So that recipient is not receiving anything that would allow them to take more Bitcoin from me or from my wallet. And I think that that's super exciting. And I think that it could actually have a very large positive impact on the identity theft problem that we have, which is really some of the basis of the fraud problem that we have on the internet today. So that's super exciting. And then I think when you add on some of the multi-signature capabilities, which I do think is going to be difficult for certain consumers to manage, but the idea that I could, even if I had a hosted wallet, and even if somebody broke into my account, and even if somebody tried to do a transaction, there would have to be multiple approvers on that transaction, and the bad guy wouldn't be able to get anywhere, I think is awesome. So I think there's a few aspects of the technology that are really going to have a positive impact on the need for consumer protections, let's hope. Yeah, those are a couple of differences.
Cool. Joe?
So all of consumer protection is based on this assumption that consumers have to trust third parties with their money, with their information, and with their decision-making to some extent. And then the laws are structured so as to make those third parties responsible, inspect them. If they're a bank, they have to do, if they're a public company, if they have to put out reports. If they're a bank, they have to do stress tests. All of these things so that consumers don't have to think about whether these third parties are trustworthy. And Bitcoin and the blockchain really turns that whole assumption on its head. So it says that you as a consumer can actually have complete control over your money. You can have complete control of your information. And you can push it here and you can push it there, or you can program it to stay in one spot for 2 years and only allow 1% out a day. You can do all these things that don't require a third party. And that's kind of revolutionary. So the technology is going to transform the way that business is done. The only question is whether we're going to apply laws and regulations for the existing and previous technology to this new technology, and kind of maybe wag the dog by the tail, so to speak.
Cool.
Anyway,
David?
One thing I think that's been one interesting development that's taken place in the UK is that some wallet providers have viewed the uncertainty and consumers' concerns as being an opportunity. So one company, Ellipsis, has started providing wallets which are insured. So insured both against price fluctuations and also against transactions with unscrupulous vendors. And those protections are then backed by Lloyd's the insurance market, and that goes some way of providing sort of third-party verification that your interests are protected. But the uncertainty there is also providing an opportunity which the market is growing into. So I think that's one very interesting approach that's been taken.
Excellent. All right, well, we have, unfortunately, we're out of time. So, guys, thank you very much for joining. I thought we had another minute for questions. So,
That was quick.
yeah, thank you very much for joining me, and thank you, guys.